Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start with one of the strangest, coldest, and funniest survival tips from medieval times. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights. You could turn on a fan to make a soft background noise. And let's take it easy as we go on our journey tonight. There was no season for winter in the Middle Ages. There was no way to save your progress, and it was a boss fight every year. When the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero, it didn't slowly go down like a leaf in the wind. It went straight down into sadness like a swan. Back then, the cold wasn't just sitting there. It wanted something. It had hopes. It worked full time. And that job was to kill peasants one frostbitten toe at a time in medieval cottages. Oh, those did about as much good as a wooden spoon in a sword fight. The best materials were used to build these homes: mud, sticks, and a shaky hope that this won't fall apart this year. The walls were made of WL and Dorb, which sounds nice until you remember that Dorb is the medieval word for whatever sticky stuff we found on the ground. There was no insulation. There were drafts. There were a lot of drafts. Drafts were like roommates. The wind liked to visit cottages from the Middle Ages. It got in through every crack, crevice, and emotional weakness in the structure of the house, moving around the room like it was doing a surprise inspection. If you were rich enough to have a window, which was just a hole cut into the wall, you covered it with cloth or wooden shutters that barely kept the cold out and mostly just flapped around like they were trying to warn you. You won't be able to do it. The hearth was supposed to keep the room warm. It made smoke instead. A lot of smoke. There was enough smoke to make anyone who came to the house think that the family inside had been politely burned. A long time ago, medieval peasants lived with watery eyes, coughing fits, and confusion about whether the fire was helping or trying to kill everyone. Families slept close together, not to bond, but because the only way to stay warm that didn't cost money or break any forest laws was to sleep close together. There was no tucking in of the kids. They were placed in a way that made them look like livestock that made heat. Congratulations if you were the youngest child. The medieval heating grid went right through you. The real test of survival was the morning. Getting out of bed meant giving up the only warmth you had left in your life. The bucket of water is frozen. The floor froze your dreams. The bread felt like a brick that was angry. Winter didn't just make things hard, it turned life into a deal. A lot of the time, peasants lost in negotiations, and that's why they set something strange on fire. You would think that peasants in the Middle Ages, who lived in forests all around them, would just go outside, pick up some logs, and enjoy a warm fire like any other sane person who was cold. People in all directions would just go outside, grab some logs, and enjoy a warm fire like any normal, freezing person would. Oh, how cute. Very valuable. That kind of hope only exists in fairy tales and modern real estate ads. In reality, life for peasants in the Middle Ages was great because almost everything belonged to someone else. A nobleman with a sword, a title, and the emotional range of a wet cabbage. Forests were not places where people could share. They were private, patrolled, and fiercely protected because they were ways to make money. And if something is a source of wealth, peasants are not allowed to touch it. That's just science from the Middle Ages. It was against the law for peasants to cut down trees. They couldn't cut off branches. They weren't able to get logs. In some places, they couldn't even pick up a fallen stick without risking a fine, jail time, or a noble loudly saying that their rights to firewood had been seriously violated. Think about it. A man who hasn't bathed since his grandfather's time yells at you, "Grandfather." That was how the peasants lived. You needed permission to even pick up dead wood, which is wood that is already on the ground and not doing anything. It was common for people not to get permission. Why let the people who grow your food stay warm after all? Warm peasants might think of things. Peasants who are warm might feel sure of themselves. We can't have that because warm peasants might start asking for fair treatment. Firewood turned into a luxury item and a sign of wealth. If your cottage smelled like real burning wood instead of, villagers thought one of three things about other things. You were either rich, stealing, or you had bribed someone important with a very big chicken. Even when peasants were able to get firewood, it was usually not very good wood. Soft, wet, half-rotten pieces that hissed and smoked like a demon with lung problems. There wasn't much firewood, so peasants had to be careful about how much they used. A log here, a log there, but never enough to keep the cold at bay, like a hungry wolf waiting outside. This wasn't just a hassle, it was risky. In the middle of winter, not having firewood meant waking up every morning not knowing if the warmth you held onto at night would come back. The cold didn't slowly seep into their homes. It boldly marched in and said, "If you can't afford wood, I'll just take your soul instead." In short, firewood wasn't an option for most peasants, so they burned something much less glamorous. You need to know why peasants froze while forests stayed untouched. Know one important thing about life in the Middle Ages. The nobility loved forests not because they needed oxygen or liked to go for scenic walks like a modern yoga influencer, but because forests made money. And if there was one thing a lord in the Middle Ages loved more than inherited power and pointless violence, it was making money on top of money. Like a medieval financial portfolio, forests fed their wealth. They gave wood for building, fuel for factories, and most importantly, places to hunt where nobles could run, on horseback and yelling at deer. These hunts weren't just for fun. They were social events, ways for men to show off their manliness, and chances to loudly remind everyone that peasants weren't allowed to come. A forest was like a treasure chest for a noble, for a peasant. It was like a huge sign that said "Don't touch," that was nailed right onto nature. To make things even nicer, many nobles made strict forest laws that controlled every twig, branch, leaf, and shadow that looked suspiciously like a person. The laws were so strict that in some places a peasant could get in trouble just for looking like they were thinking about touching a tree. The punishment could be them anything from fines to mutilation, depending on the Lord's mood and whether or not he had eaten breakfast. Nobles would rather let a whole forest rot than let peasants use it to heat their homes. People thought it was very rebellious for a peasant to think that a fallen log could keep their family warm. After all, peasants needed to stay cold, tired, and obedient, not warm, comfortable, and full of ideas. And of course, when winter came, the nobles were fine. They had roaring hearths, several fireplaces, layered tapestries, fur blankets, and enough servants to keep the fire going all the time. They could walk around their halls in comfort, while peasants outside argued about whether toes were important body parts. The difference was huge. Nobility thought of forests as signs of status and places to get more land. Peasants saw men who basically said, "You will freeze before I let you touch my precious logs," guarded forests like huge piles of warmth that no one could get to. This wasn't because they didn't know what they were doing. On purpose, a system that kept peasants dependent and cold while lords enjoyed the luxury of burning as much wood as they wanted. With wood locked behind layers of rules, punishments, and privilege, peasants turned to the next best thing, or the next best thing, depending on how you see it. Worst thing. Once you realize that peasants in the Middle Ages lived close to whole forests that they weren't allowed to touch, everything starts to make sense, or at least medieval sense, which is a lower and more chaotic standard of logic. Peasants had to play a dangerous game of what burns and how angry will God be if I set it on fire, because firewood was kept behind a wall of noble privilege. Dead plants, brambles, twigs, dried weeds, and anything else that grows in a hedge were the first alternative fuel source. That wasn't protected by a man with a sword. This wasn't wood for the fire. This was trash from nature. It burned quickly, weakly, and went out faster than a medieval marriage without a dowry. But it was something. Next on the list were broken things around the house, like worn-out stools, broken wagon handles, and tools that had broken beyond repair. If it was made of wood and wasn't useful anymore, it went into the fire. Not because peasants were wasteful. They couldn't afford to waste anything. It was because the cold made everyone want to set things on fire. Good intentions. Then there was thatch, which was technically flammable, but also necessary to keep rain from falling directly on your bed. Burning thatch was a very bad idea. It was like selling your car to pay the electric bill in the Middle Ages, a short-term win, but a long-term disaster. Still, some families burned patched-up pieces of old thatch in the coldest winters and hoped that the new piece wouldn't fall on their heads in the spring. But in the end, peasants found out that animal droppings were the real MVP of medieval heating. This wasn't the last thing they could do. It was a dependable, renewable, and surprisingly plentiful resource. Every morning, the barnyard brought them fresh, steaming possibilities right to their door. It didn't matter if the cow had a point of view or the sheep had an attitude. They were making fuel as long as they were eating. People didn't think this was strange. This was how to stay alive. Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't look at a pile of manure and think, how? They thought it was disgusting. just like people today think of a Black Friday sale. Someone else will take this if I don't, and I'll be sorry. The logic became clear. If it hurts, burn it. Try burning it if it might burn. If it doesn't look like it should burn, you should definitely burn it. Peasants lived in a world where being creative wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing keeping them from the kind of cold that could turn you into a historical artifact. And that's when poop stopped being trash and turned into fuel. Every morning in the Middle Ages was the same. A rooster made a noise. A person groaned. Someone else asked what life was all about. The animals also politely left the day's heating supply on the floor of the barn. It wasn't a problem because in a world where firewood was illegal and winter was trying to kill you, this wasn't a problem. It was a gift. A warm, steaming, and slightly scented blessing. People today step around animal poop. To people in the Middle Ages, they were like gold that could be used as money again and again. The medieval version of passive income was to buy livestock instead of stocks and get patties instead of dividends. Business was booming. Cows were the best at making fuel, calm, slow, and giving. A cow could quickly turn yesterday's grass into today's heating system. Horses were right behind them. They added their fair share, even though they were more picky about what they put out. Smaller sheep and goats. High-frequency payloads, which is nature's way of giving you payments over time. Peasant kids often had to gather the morning fuel harvest. And no, they weren't hurt. They didn't need counseling. They needed gloves that weren't made yet. Kids learned early on that the barn was the quickest way to get warm. They would walk out half asleep, pick up the things, and carry them home like little, underpaid workers. Adults did the same thing, but with more dignity, or at least the medieval ideas of dignity usually meant not falling down. Someone who was walking on icy ground with a basket of fresh manure needed to be perfectly balanced, have strong legs, and not be ashamed at all. You didn't just lose your gas if you fell, you lost your respect. The best part was that no one judged you, not your family, not your neighbors, and not even the animals. People in the Middle Ages knew that life was hard and that they had to deal with it. And sometimes, in the cold morning air, that mess was steaming. And let's not act like this was optional. If a village didn't get enough fuel every day, the cold would come back, like a tax collector who heard a rumor that you had a spare chicken hidden somewhere. So the peasants accepted what was going to happen. They included it in their daily lives. Get up, stay alive, eat something beige, and pick up poop. It was predictable, dependable, and almost comforting, like watching your breath freeze indoors at dawn. The animals were not just farm animals, they were the heating grid for the village, and they made deliveries every morning. Getting the raw material was just the first step. It took skill, patience, and a level of emotional detachment that only living in the Middle Ages could teach you to turn it into something that could be burned and was nice enough to put in your home. To begin, the fresh dung had to be mixed with something fibrous, like straw, chaff, dried grass, or any other plant matter that a goat with trust issues hadn't already eaten. This mix helped the patties hold their shape. To put it another way, It stopped them from falling apart into a sad, wet pile of "we tried." It's like pottery from the Middle Ages, but the clay was alive 5 minutes before. The act of mixing was a form of meditation. You had to face two universal truths when you kneaded the warm, earthy mixture with your hands. One, warmth is warmth, even if it seems strange. And two, people in the Middle Ages didn't care about your personal space. Once the mixture was the right consistency, neither too wet nor too crumbly, and hopefully only mildly scary peasants shaped it into patties. These patties were perfectly round because people can't help but make a neat little circle, even when they're working with this material. Fashion changed from one area to another. Some people liked patties that were thinner and dried faster, while others liked discs that were thicker and burned more slowly. It was like a medieval version of different kinds of pizza, but no one was excited about it. Then it was time to dry. Picture yourself walking around a village and seeing hundreds of brown patties stuck to every wall, fence, barn, and a flat surface that is open. People from the South sometimes thought these were just for show. No, they weren't. They were the community's future warmth, sticking to walls like very determined pancakes. It could take days or even weeks for things to dry, depending on the weather. The sun and wind were fine, but the rain was a total disaster that turned all your hard work into a horrible mess that slid down the wall like something out of a medieval horror movie. Villagers ran outside to save their patties if a storm was coming. They picked them up like they were priceless artifacts, but sometimes the kids made it a competition to see whose patties were the biggest, smoothest, or best shaped. Adults didn't think this was funny because the kids were usually right. The patties changed when they were completely dry. They turned into solid discs that could be burned and stacked neatly like big medieval poker chips. Not pretty? Yes. Does it smell? Sometimes. To save a life? Yes, of course. These were no longer poop. They were fuel. Medieval fuel made by hand, in small batches, and from local sources. It wasn't just a practical thing to do to dry dung cakes. It was a show for everyone. Everyone in the village saw your patties. Everyone thought your patties were bad. If there was no entertainment, gossip, or indoor hobbies, watching your neighbor's fuel dry on their wall was like watching TV in the Middle Ages. After making the patties, peasants slapped them onto anything they could find. Walls of cottages, barns, fences, gates, and sometimes even the neighbor's house if they hadn't. Wanted to subtly show that they were in charge after an argument. The goal was clear. Let them get some sun and wind until they become strong enough to be something you wouldn't mind having in your home. But here's the thing. Sometimes patties didn't dry out well. At times, they drooped. At times, they drooped. Sometimes they slid down the wall slowly and sadly, leaving a mark that said, "This family is having a bad winter." The villagers noticed. They always paid attention. A good patty was a point of pride, smooth, even, firm, and dried evenly. If your definition of art was very broad, this would be a work of art. People silently judged the neighbor with the lumpy, cracked patties as someone who didn't have discipline, ambition, or well fed animals. The rain was the worst enemy. A storm that comes out of nowhere could ruin days of work, turning carefully made patties into a horrible brown avalanche. When the clouds came, the peasants ran outside in a panic, grabbing the patties off the walls and putting them under cover like they were priceless treasures. Think about how Beethoven saved his sheet music. You get the idea if you switch out the sheet music for steaming manure. The animals added to the mess, too. Chickens are naturally curious and rude, so they pecked at drying patties for fun. Dogs knocked over piles. Goats that were angry and crazy sometimes ate them. If your goat ate your winter fuel, it would have to eat cold leftovers for the rest of the season. The drying time also filled the smell in the village was strong. Warm earth, a hint of barnyard, and a warning to not breathe too deeply near the walls. People who pass through often say that the smell is rustic, natural, or very local. Even though it was messy, embarrassing, and always possible that the weather would cause problems, drying patties was necessary. A properly dried dung cake burned longer, hotter, and cleaner than any wet stick peasants could safely gather. And when those patties were done, it was time to bring them inside, because nothing said cozy medieval home like a neat stack of hardened barn gifts kept by the fireplace. We need to deal with the medieval cow in the fireplace at some point. The smell, because yes, burning dung has a smell, a personality, and a presence. It's not the pleasant smell of pine wood wafting through the air. It's not the warm smell of braised bed that just came out of the oven. It has the unmistakable smell of survival with a little bit of don't ask questions. When a dung fire burned, it didn't quietly send its smell into the cottage. It made a big deal out of itself. It got into your clothes, your hair, your blankets, and your soul. Before they even got there, visitors could tell which villages used dung fires by sniffing the air and saying, "Ah, they're warming themselves today." But here's the surprising part. Peasants didn't really care. When you live in a world where winter is trying to kill you, your idea of what a problem is changes a lot every night. A little smell of the barn is fine. The porridge tonight had a hint of smoke, which was fine. The air in the cottage smells like a mix of dirt, smoke, and something that smells like a barn. It's not even worth mentioning. People in the Middle Ages were shocked at how good the smell was. Chroniclers used words like earthy, natural, and warm, which is historian language for I'm trying very hard not to say what this actually smells like. Travelers passing through peasant homes often describe the atmosphere as thick, rustic, or comfortably smoky, which means I will remember this smell for the rest of my life. Inside the home, the family adjusted. After a few minutes, the human nose gave up, waved a little white flag, and said, "You know what? Let's just pretend this is fine." The smoke, on the other hand, had its own plans. Chimneys in the Middle Ages were more ideas than real things, and smoke loved to drift sideways, sink down, or hover in the room like an unwanted guest who didn't know how to behave. But, and this is the shocking part, the smell had one big plus. It was bad for bugs, fleas, lice, mosquitoes, or any other small bug that was trying to ruin your day. They hated the smell of dung. The cottage might have smelled like a barn on fire, but at least no one was using your skin as an all you can eat buffet. The smell wasn't nice, but it was safe. It wasn't pretty, but it meant warmth. And warmth in a world that was colder than 30 degrees below zero was worth its weight in gold. So, yes, peasants in the Middle Ages burned dung, and yes, it made their homes smell bad, which would scare modern homeowners. But for them, looks were never more important than survival. Here's the twist that medieval peasants would like us to remember. Despite all the jokes, the smells, the patties on the walls, and the bad choices they made in life, it really worked to burn dung. Not just a little bit, not even close, but they really worked well, most of the time, better than the sad excuses for firewood they were sometimes allowed to collect. Cow dung, in particular, burns slowly and steadily, not in a dramatic or romantic way. It doesn't make the sparks that crackle in movies. Instead, it burns like the way peasants lived in the Middle Ages, quietly, stubbornly, and against all odds. If you stacked a few dung cakes in the fireplace and lit them, they would smolder for hours, like an old man who won't give up, not leaving a tavern when it closed, and that slow burn was just what a medieval cottage needed. These houses weren't very big. They didn't have insulation. They were fancy boxes that let heat out in all directions. So, it was a good thing that the fire stayed alive for hours, even though it smelled like the back of a barn. A small, smoky, and somewhat offensive blessing. There was another secret benefit to dung. It burned hotter than most of the legal wood that peasants were allowed to touch when they fell. Half-rotten logs and burning decayed brush quickly and didn't make much heat. Some were so wet that they hissed in the fire as if they were angry to be there. But the dung cakes burned with the calm confidence of fuel that knew it was doing you a favor. Strangely, dried dung made popping embers that were less dangerous than wood. This meant that there were fewer accidental fires, fewer times when people panicked, and fewer mornings when the roof was on fire. This was a big deal because the world was made of flammable thatch roofs and walls held together by hope. On top of. That said, dung smoke didn't smell great, but it did have health benefits and helped keep things fresh. The constant flow of warm smoke through the cottage helped dry clothes, keep food fresh, and even clean the air in a way that we could call medieval. You wouldn't want to put it in a bottle and sell it as a perfume, but fleas and other bugs hated it. The peasants knew something deep. Fire wasn't a luxury, it was about living. And poop, no matter how humble its beginnings, did that job better than anyone thought they would. So, yes, they did burn dung. Not because it was nice or fashionable, but because you use whatever burns when winter tries to kill you, even if it used to move. If you think dung fires were only used for heat, you don't know how much people in the Middle Ages could do at once. Peasants didn't have the luxury of having different appliances. There was no system for heating or cooking here. No, in a real medieval home, one smoky, questionable, the fire smelled a little bit, and took care of everything. For warmth, cooking, drying clothes, getting rid of bugs, and sometimes making guests rethink their life choices. But here's the twist that will surprise you. It was great to cook over dung fires. Not in a Michelin star way, unless Michelin starts giving stars for cooking that stays at a steady simmer even with barnyard smells, but in a way that keeps you alive. Dung doesn't burn with a lot of drama. It doesn't make a loud noise or spit sparks. It makes heat that is slow, steady, and dependable instead. When you're boiling a pot of barley for the 7th day in a row, this is the right kind of heat. Peasants ate food that didn't need to be perfect. Porridge, stews, broths, and anything else you could put in a pot and forget about while you spent the rest of the day not dying of cold. A dung fire could keep a pot of water boiling for hours. It gurgled softly, like it was singing old-fashioned lullabies. This slow cooking method made grains softer, tough meat scraps more tender, and flavors mixed so well that the end result was almost good, or at least not as sad. And unlike wood fires, dung didn't suddenly flare up and burn the bottom of the pot. There weren't any sudden bursts of heat that turned dinner into a sculpture made of charcoal. The worst that could happen was that the stew would pick up a little bit of the smell of the barn, which everyone in the cottage was already breathing. Many families in the Middle Ages actually preferred to cook over dung fires. They were steady, reliable, and worked together. You could trust them to watch over the fire, the pot while you went outside to yell at a goose that had taken your laundry. Dung fires also had a secret part to play in keeping food safe. Long before anyone knew what microbes were, the constant warm smoke that drifted through the cottage helped dry herbs, keep meats fresh, and keep microbes away. Hanging sausage near the fire made it dry faster. If you put cheese on a shelf above the fire, it didn't grow a lot of bacteria. Instead, it formed a hard rind, and maybe most importantly, the smell of cooking hid the smell of burning. Poop. The cottage smelled more like rustic broth and less like someone had set fire to the barn floor when the stew was thick, hearty, and bubbling. This wasn't strange to peasants in the Middle Ages. This was effective. This was living. This was their slow cooker, which was powered by a cow from yesterday. If you think that medieval kids would be horrified, disgusted, or emotionally traumatized by having to collect dung, you're giving them too much credit. These kids weren't like kids today who grew up with cartoons, tablets, and indoor plumbing. These kids thought that a stick was the best piece of entertainment technology. They didn't mind picking up animal poop. It was the day of the week. As soon as a child could walk without falling into a puddle of mud, they were put on the team that made fuel for the house. No training, no warning, and no easy way to get started. One day you're walking around the cottage with a piece of straw in your mouth. The next day, someone gives you a small wooden scoop and tells you to go get the warm stuff. And they did it happily, with the false confidence of youth. At dawn, little kids walked into the barn, half asleep and wearing big wool tunics, ready to pick up the morning's fresh delivery. They knew each animal's personality. They knew which cow ate too much, which goat aimed its poop at people on purpose, and which horse could make fuel-rich works of art the size of a dinner roll. They didn't think dung was trash. It was warm. It was to stay alive. It was the difference between shivering all night at 30 degrees below zero and being able to feel your fingers the next morning. The kids weren't afraid. They were useful. Picking up patties made you feel better. If you didn't do it, you would freeze. It wasn't a choice based on morals. It was science. Some kids even made fun of the whole thing, which is what kids do. Who could get the most? Who found the biggest piece? Who could make the best patty? These competitions led to whole sibling rivalries, and yes, there were fights. Out. You stole my dung pile was the start of many childhood fights. Adults took drying and storing patties seriously, but kids were more creative. They put handprints on the patties. They put them in patterns on the wall. They came up with dung art long before any museum curator could question their sanity. Of course, things went wrong. A child would slip on ice while carrying a full basket, landing in a way that tested their will to. Live. Parents ran out, not because they were worried about getting hurt, but because losing a basket full of fresh fuel would have been a disaster. Are you okay? But did the patties survive? Was always the next question. By the time these kids were adults, handling dung was second nature to them. They didn't move. They didn't say anything. They didn't think about it. They thought this was normal. This was normal. This was how life was. And every handful was important for surviving the winter. You thought the Middle Ages were over. Peasants couldn't think of new things to burn. So let me introduce peat, the dark, muddy, ancient cousin of firewood. Peasants used it whenever they lived near marshes, bogs, or any other patch of land that looked like it wanted to swallow a cow whole. Peat wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, and that was enough to make it a star. Peat is basically plant matter that has been compressed and has been underground for hundreds of years, turning into dense, flammable bricks that are not quite coal and not quite. The soil is definitely burnable. To the peasants, peat was a gift from nature, specifically from the wet, unpleasant parts of nature. While the rich burned wood in their big halls, the poor trudged out into the bogs with shovels and false hope. Cutting peat was a big deal. You walked out into a place that was half land, half water, and half quicksand. Yes, that's 3 halves. Welcome to math from the Middle Ages. Each step was a risk. Would you go down a little or a lot? Would you lose a shoe and have to choose between getting it back or letting the bog keep it? You used a special spade to cut peat's bricks once you got to the cutting spot. These bricks were heavy, wet, and very determined to ruin your clothes. You put them in neat piles to dry because, like dung, peat only burns well when you get rid of all the extra swamp juice. It took weeks of patience to dry peat. Your neatly stacked bricks were outside during this time, waiting for the sun to dry them, and for animals shouldn't walk on them. Chickens, sheep, and goats saw drying peat as an invitation to play, a new thing to stand on, kick over, or chew on. Animals in the Middle Ages didn't care about personal space or the things they needed in the winter, but after it dried, peat looked great. It burned slowly and evenly, hotter than dung and cooler than high-quality wood. It also smelled a lot less than the barn-based alternative, peat smoke, which had its own smell, somewhere between the ground and the forest. After the rain, which smelled like a fancy spa compared to burning dung, peat also lasted a long time. A few bricks could keep a house warm all night, so you wouldn't have to go outside as often to get more. In places like Ireland and Scotland, peat was more than just a source of fuel. It was a cultural symbol, a tradition that had been going on for hundreds of years, and a dependable friend in the fight against the cold in the winter. Yes, peasants in the Middle Ages did burn peat, not because they liked mud, but because peat burned well and never complained. You just set the thermostat and maybe press a button, and there you have it, warmth. Back in the Middle Ages, you couldn't just push a button to heat your home. It wasn't even hard work. It was a way of life, a full-time job, and a never-ending fight against a cold that woke up every morning ready to fight. From dawn to dusk, winter survival meant gathering, shaping, drying, burning, and praying that nothing went wrong. If you didn't get ready for winter as a peasant in the Middle Ages. You fought with it every day, like a tired parent fights with a toddler who wants to make trouble. The first step was to gather fuel, a fashionable morning walk to look for the droppings from the day before, pick up brittle weeds, pick up fallen brambles, or, if you were very lucky, find a small, forgotten stick that the Lord's forester hadn't yelled at someone for touching. Then you went back home and made patties, stacked peat, or sorted things, kindling like a medieval squirrel with a lot of baggage. The fire itself came next. It wasn't as easy to start a fire as just striking a match. There weren't any matches. There was flint, steel, and a level of patience that only saints have. You scraped until sparks flew, hoping they would land somewhere useful, and kept the small flames safe from drafts like you would a baby from assassins. And once the fire was going, good job. You had to watch it all day now. The dung fires burned slowly. It was great for keeping warm, but not so great for people who wanted to leave the cottage for more than 12 seconds. If you wandered off for too long, you'd come back to a cold hearth that looked like it was betraying you. Pete had to turn, move around, and stack the wet brambles in a certain way. They hissed and crackled as if they were angry that they were burning in the first place. Everything needed to be looked at. And at night, oh, night was the real test. You couldn't let the fire go out because it was too cold to light it again in the morning. Spiritual torture. Families put the coals under ash, like putting babies to sleep, whispered words of encouragement, and prayed to every saint in the calendar that the embers would still be alive by morning. But not always. And when you woke up, the cottage would be colder than a nobleman's heart. The air would be freezing, the water would be solid in the bucket, and you would know that you were going to spend the whole day starting the heating process over again. Fire wasn't warm in the winter of the Middle Ages. It was a job. Work that never stops, wears you out, and takes away your dignity. And every day, peasants fought that battle. In the Middle Ages, your social class wasn't just written down in laws or on tax records. It had a smell. Yes, that's right. A visitor to a village didn't have to ask who was rich and who wasn't. They just sniffed the air like a wine critic who thought they knew everything and said, "Ah, this cottage burns peat. These people have taste." At the same time, the dung that was burning in the house had a smell that was more like farming. The truth was easy to see. In a medieval village, the fuel you used was also your social life. You were doing well if your cottage smelled a little like peat. Peat wasn't fancy, but it burned cleaner than dung, lasted longer, and didn't make your house smell like a warm barn. Peat was a good fuel, practical and middle class. I can't afford wood, but I'm not going to freeze either. But if your house smelled like firewood, people thought you were either rich or a criminal if you had real firewood that snapped and crackled and smelled like a forest instead of a stable. And to be honest, the line between those two groups was very thin. Anyone who burned real logs was either a noble, a church institution, or that one villager who mysteriously found branches every day and had no idea how they kept finding them. Everyone knew that they were stealing wood, but no one said anything because snitching meant you could lose the chance to borrow a log in an emergency. But if your cottage smelled like cow dung, you were normal. Normal in a bad way, but also in a good way. The dung was what brought everyone together and kept them going. It didn't matter if you worked hard, were honest, respected others, or cared about your family. People thought you were part of the majority, broke, cold, and doing your best if your house smelled like the south end of a northbound ox. Some villagers even took pride in how twisted it was. Oh, yes, that's what we smell, the scent of life. And, of course, the nobles had their own ideas. They would say that the smell of burning dung in cottages was rustic, earthy, or a sign of bad breeding, depending on how bored they were. They never had to smell like this themselves. Servants who were freezing for their boss brought in logs the size of tree trunks to feed their fireplaces. The smell of fuel became a kind of social language, a code, and a hierarchy. Dung, poor but still alive. Peat, humble. Comfort, wood, rich or guilty. If your cottage didn't smell like anything, you were either lying or already dead. You didn't just burn fuel in the Middle Ages. You wore it on your clothes, in your hair, and in how people saw you. It wasn't enough to wear a shiny crown and sit on a throne that looked like it would break your back to be a king in the Middle Ages. It was a full-time job, a delicate balancing act between divine authority, political theater, and the constant fear of being caught. That half of the people in the banquet hall wanted to work for you. People said that a king in the Middle Ages was God's chosen representative on earth. In reality, though, he was just a very stressed-out landlord with an army. The king had control over land, which meant money, which meant power. In theory, he owns all the fields, forests, and muddy villages. In reality, he owned it only if the nobles really listened, and medieval nobles listened about as much as toddlers who were hyped up on honey cakes. Still, the king was. The law itself. It was against the law if he said it was. Congratulations if he said something was legal. It was okay. even though it was a crime to hang someone 5 minutes earlier. But being a king wasn't the easy, I command you to obey fantasy that modern movies love to show. There was always a low hum of danger in the background. Your borders were wanted by foreign enemies. Your throne was wanted by noble families. Your family wanted your crown. The church would sometimes remind you that your power came from their blessing. A king could go from being God's chosen ruler to falling down some stairs while eating dinner faster than you could say, "Long live the king." Royal etiquette was a battle in and of itself. One wrong bow, one banner in the wrong place, or one noble showing up at court with a sword that was too shiny. All of these could be seen as disrespectful, or, even worse, rebellious. Kings had to read gestures like fortune tellers read tea leaves. Was the Duke just not thirsty if he didn't want wine at dinner, or did he mean to insult the other person's politics in a way that could start a war? But even though they were under a lot of stress, kings looked like they were in charge of everything. The throne room was carefully set up, high ceilings, echoing halls, fancy robes, and enough gold embroidery to blind a small town. Visitors, especially nobles, were reminded of the power of the person they were standing in front of. They could reward loyalty with land or punish disobedience with a quick visit from the royal executioner. It wasn't cool to be a king in the Middle Ages. It was dangerous. I was so tired. But it was the top of the food chain, and everyone else knew it. Dukes were the wolves that lived just below kings in medieval politics, strong, territorial, and always pushing the limits. A duke was in charge of a duchy, which was like a small kingdom with all the drama, backstabbing, and political scheming, but without the crown that said, "God wants me here." Dukes didn't rule the whole realm, they only ruled their own. And, at times, that line felt dangerously thin. Dukes weren't polite little vassals who waited for orders from the king. These men led armies that were bigger than some whole kingdoms. They had their own courts and laws, and in many cases they had more money than the king. It wasn't just dinner if a duke threw a party. It was a smart show of strength. The number of servants, the amount of wine, the gold plates, and the musicians hired from 4 countries away were all carefully chosen to say, "I'm important. And I know you know I'm important." And kings did too. They knew because a duke who was unhappy was more than just a problem. He was a person who could have started a civil war. A duke might feel slighted if he didn't get the marriage alliance he wanted, or if the king looked at him funny during a council meeting. By the end of the week, he could have thousands of knights. Dukes were like people juggling lit torches while standing on an oil barrel to medieval kings. Interesting to watch, scary to deal with. Dukes also thought ahead. They set up marriages not for love, but to get land. They made deals with other nobles in the same way that people today make group chats, but these chats sometimes ended with catapults. Some dukes quietly built up favors, debts, and loyalties until one day they woke up and realized they had enough power to fight the king. A few of them did. A lot of them came close. Some of them even made it. Dukes acted like kings and queens in their own regions. They held court sessions, settled disputes, collected taxes, and expected everyone on their land to do exactly what they said. Their flags flew over the walls of the castle like flags of territory, reminding everyone that going into a douche meant entering a duke's own kingdom. But their drive was both a blessing and a curse. A duke could become very powerful, but if he led a rebellion that went wrong, insulted the wrong royal cousin, or had a hunting accident that seemed too good to be true, his duchy could be taken away from him in a flash. Because being second in line for power meant one thing: you were always close enough to the throne to touch it or fall from it. Dukes were the ambitious regional leaders of the Middle Ages, while counts were the tired department heads who were stuck between two worlds, strong enough to make a difference, but not strong enough to sleep well. A count was in charge of a county, land, villages, forests, taxes, soldiers, and pretty much everything else except for the right to act like he was a king. Counts were the glue that held medieval. They would never say that they were kingdoms, but they were. They thought of themselves as heroes who weren't getting enough credit in a world full of egos wearing crowns. Dukes acted like they were born to be great, but counts were always aware of their surroundings. The king needs me, but he shouldn't know that I know he needs me. So they walked a tightrope of loyalty, and they became too independent and unimportant. When the king came with an army, he asked them some polite but firm questions about their taxes. Counts took care of everything. Crime is their issue. The roads are falling apart. That's their problem. The peasants are rioting because the last harvest failed. It's definitely their problem. When the king called, they had to raise troops, which meant getting local knights to leave their comfortable halls and convincing peasants that going to war was somehow good for them. It wasn't very often. Counts still had real power, though. They ruled from their castles, collected taxes, and gave out justice. Little kings and queens, but with fewer tapestries and definitely fewer musicians. Their choruses were where people argued about land claims, settled disputes, and criminals who were unlucky learned what medieval justice really meant. Spoiler, it wasn't nice. Counts were the swing votes in the medieval political hierarchy. When a duke got too brave, the king often called on counts to keep things in check. The king would say, "Help me." He would say, "For the good of the realm," as if anyone believed that. But counts knew how to play the game. They could settle noble feuds, decide border disputes, and sometimes, if the timing was right, take over another noble's land by stepping into their bad luck. But they were always worried. If they were too successful, a jealous duke might march in too weak, and the king might replace them with someone who was better at their job or more obedient. It was like trying to keep order in a bar full of knights who had been drinking since sunrise for the count. Loud, messy, and one fight. Not a total disaster, but even though they were stressed, counts stood their ground. They weren't just in the middle of the medieval power pyramid. Everything else depended on them. If counts were the busy middle managers of medieval nobility, then viscounts were the unlucky assistant managers who had to deal with all the same problems but got half the credit. A viscount didn't rule the county directly. He helped rule it, which in medieval times meant doing the hard work while the count took the fame. Their job title literally meant Viscount, which says a lot about how people in the Middle Ages saw them. They were important, needed, and totally taken for granted. Most Viscounts started their days by doing the things that the Count didn't want to think about: tax fights, land fights, knights who had too much free time, jurisdictional squabbles, and peasants who wouldn't stop complaining about things like famine and wolves. Everyone praised the Count when the county ran smoothly. If the county fell apart, everyone blamed the Viscount when things went wrong. It worked perfectly, unless you were the Viscount. Viscounts were in charge of big parts of land for the Count, especially when the Count was busy with more important things like hunting, throwing parties, or not upsetting the king. This meant that the Viscount was always on the move, checking on villages, holding court, and giving orders to local leaders. He had power, but it was limited. One pull from the Count, and everything was different. Viscounts had real power. Even though they were junior, they could punish people, collect certain taxes, and lead troops in the Count's name. But don't get it wrong, they didn't own their power, they borrowed it. If they used it wrong, the Count could take it away with a sentence as short as, "We need to talk." In medieval politics, that usually meant exile, imprisonment, or a sudden hunting accident. Still, Viscounts were often very ambitious. A lot of people used their position to make friends with knights, lower-ranking nobles, and even church leaders. They knew the county's problems better than anyone else, which also meant they knew exactly how to get their way. Some Viscounts quietly grew their wealth, married into important families, or made themselves seem like important advisors. Some even rose high enough that their descendants became counts, but most of them lived in a cycle of endless duty and little reward. They were close enough to feel powerful, but never close enough to fully claim it. A Viscount's life was a reminder of an eternal truth in the Middle Ages. Sometimes the one doing the work is not the one wearing the crown or even the fancy hat. Barons were the most important members of the nobility in the Middle Ages, the enforcers on the ground who made sure the king's big plans didn't fall apart as soon as someone left the castle. Kings ruled kingdoms, dukes ruled duchies, and barons ruled something much less stable: people's nature. Their estates were smaller, but their big responsibilities. A baron didn't just rule over land. He was in charge of the daily chaos of life in the feudal system. A baron's land might have a few villages, a small castle, and a few forests full of poachers who acted like they didn't know hunting was against the law. Counts and dukes took care of big political issues, while barons took care of the problems that came up when people yelled about stolen chickens and were covered in mud. They were the aristocrats who had to deal with the kingdom's messy reality. Depending on the area, barons got their land directly from the king or from a higher noble. In return, they had to serve in the military. A baron couldn't just send a polite letter when war broke out. He had to get knights together, hire peasants, get supplies, and leave right away. Most barons spent their whole lives getting ready for wars that often started because someone insulted the wrong banner. They had power over local justice, which meant they were in charge of memorials. Courts. These weren't the big royal courts with polished marble and velvet robes. No, baronial courts were held in drafty halls where decisions were made based on what people said, what was customary, and how the baron felt that morning. Trial by ordeal was still popular, which shows that it doesn't make sense to question medieval logic. But even though their land was rough, barons had real power. They could give knights land, make peasants work, collect taxes, and build walls. They were the most important parts that kept feudalism going. The whole system would fall apart faster than a wooden bridge in a rainstorm if there were no barons. They found a middle ground in terms of social issues. Not strong enough to fight the great lords, but too important to be ignored. Barons were always fighting for their rights, making deals with counts, and stopping small fights from turning into big wars. Their power came from being close by. They were always there, always watching, and always making sure the rules were followed. Baronists didn't have a lot of land or power, led huge armies, but they were one of a kind. They were the people who made royal orders come true, settled the daily arguments of the medieval world, and kept things in order when things were always out of order. They weren't the most important nobles, but they were strong, stubborn, and very important. People often think of knights as brave heroes, charging across open fields with banners flying and sunlight shining off their polished armor. But the truth about the Middle Ages was less, more tiring and less glamorous. A knight was basically a heavily armed land manager who also worked as a shock trooper. They bought their loyalty with land, titles, and the promise that if they died in battle in a glorious way, someone might write a poem about them that was not too flattering. A knight's status was based on one thing: how well he served. He didn't get ahead in politics like a duke or get lost in paperwork like a viscount. Knights got their rank by fighting well all the time and not running away when things got tough. Very loud. A baron or count gave them a fief, which was basically a piece of land, and the peasants who lived on it, as a reward for their bravery. The peasants worked and brought food. The knight brought strength. It was the simplest trade deal in feudalism, but being a knight meant always being ready. Armor didn't take care of itself, horses didn't learn on their own, and swords didn't magically get sharper overnight. A knight spent a lot of his life getting ready, practicing with weapons, patrolling borders, settling small disputes, and making sure no one stole his cows. Fights, and making sure no one stole his cows. Movies show knights riding into battle on horseback in a grand way. Knights in the Middle Ages spent more time fighting with blacksmiths, yelling at squires, and paying taxes on everything from gates to grain. Knights were expected to be noble in courtly settings. They learned how to behave, play music, write poetry, and not embarrass their lord at meals. But even though they did chivalric rituals, they were still warriors at heart, trained to follow orders, protect their lord's interests, and when necessary, charge headfirst into situations that a sane person would stay away from. Knights were also used for political purposes. A lord was strong if he had a lot of loyal knights. A lord whose knights were unhappy was going to lose. Knights could change the course of local politics, support or crush rebellions. Their presence at a manor helped keep things in order. People often caused trouble when they weren't there. Knights had a lot of respect, but they also had a lot of stress. Their thief had to pay for a bad harvest. Shame came from losing a battle. A baron who was unhappy meant eviction, and chivalry, the great code that everyone looked up to, was more of an idea than a way of life. A lot of knights lived with honor. A lot more people lived in a real way. Knights were still very important. They were strong, disciplined, armored, and never gave up. They were the strong steel backs of noble armies, and a clear sign that power in the Middle Ages didn't just sit on thrones. It went into battle. They weren't counts, dukes, or kings, but when war broke out, they were the first to attack and the last to pull back. Under the armored prestige of knights was a group of nobles who lived in a blurry area between having power and being useless. These were the lesser nobles, minor lords, petty landholders, castellans, and hereditary troublemakers who owned land that wasn't big enough to brag about, but was too important to ignore. They didn't have enough power to lead armies or make deals, but they weren't just simple farmers either. They were always trying to move up the ladder while acting like they were already at the top, belonged at the top. A lesser noble might be in charge of a single village, a manor house, or a piece of forest that doesn't matter strategically. Their titles changed from place to place. Some were called lords, others gentlemen, and still others castellans, but their jobs were all very similar. Keep things in order, collect rents, take care of the property, and make sure no one stole the animals. They were the middle class of the nobility, always trying to balance their duties with their limited resources. Being close to each other was their best asset. They lived close to their people and even closer, still to their problems. They saw the failed harvests, the arguments over fences, the unpaid tithes, and the neighbor who kept saying that his cow accidentally wandered into someone else's field. Counts and dukes took care of politics, while lesser nobles took care of people. But these smaller nobles also had big goals. Many people wanted to marry someone with more power, get more land, or catch the eye of a more powerful lord. A flattering letter to a baron, a smart marriage alliance, or heroic. In just one generation, serving in battle could make a family rich. They knew this, so they took their time. Every feast they went to, every banner they carried, and every favor they did for someone else was a planned step up the social ladder. Still, their lives were simple. A lesser noble's castle was often just a fortified manor with more drafty corners than walls. They had a small but hard-working staff at home, and every day they had to settle fights between neighbors, settle inheritance disputes, and making the peasants believe that taxes were necessary for the good of the kingdom. Even though they didn't have much power, they were important for keeping the feudal system stable. They were the main part of local government, filling in the gaps that higher nobles left. They made sure the roads were safe, that tithes got to the right people, and that they were the first line of defense when raiders showed up. Lesser nobles didn't run kingdoms, but they did run everyday life. They were the foot soldiers of the aristocracy, the quiet leaders, and the local officials who kept the medieval world going even when no one thanked them. They weren't powerful, they weren't weak, they were very important. If medieval society were a beautiful, colorful tapestry of nobles, then sergeants and household officers were the strong, stubborn threads that held it all together. These men weren't nobles in the fancy sense. They didn't throw big parties, own huge duchies, or march around in cloaks with gold trim. They were the professional class of medieval power, though, trained fighters, administrators, and specialists who kept noble households running in a way that looked like order. A sergeant wasn't a knight, but he wasn't just a peasant with a stick either. You could think of him as a highly skilled contractor from the Middle Ages. Some sergeants were soldiers who had been well trained and were in charge of protecting castles, patrolling borders, and helping knights in battle. They wore armor and carried swords, crossbows, or spears. Good armor, and did all the risky work that knights would rather not do themselves. A knight might ride into battle with great style. A sergeant held the line, took the hits, and made sure everything stayed in place. Other sergeants were experts in their fields, such as castle gatekeepers, bridge wardens, messengers, mounted couriers, and professional guards who were given the keys to rooms full of things nobles didn't want stolen. When nobles needed something done right, they could count on these men, especially when it was a task that didn't take a lot of time. More skill and less bragging. Then there were the household officers, who were in charge of keeping noble households from falling apart. The steward was in charge of the money and the estate. The marshal was in charge of the stables and the military. The bailiff enforced local laws and collected rents even when angry villagers yelled at him. The chamberlain was in charge of the lord's private rooms and acted as his personal assistant, having access to everything, even secrets. These officers didn't get their power from their birthright. They got it from their skills. A good steward could make a baron's money grow faster than a dozen tax laws. A skilled marshal could turn a group of people who didn't know how to fight into a real defense force. A trusted chamberlain could tell secrets that changed the course of politics. And the nobles knew how much they were worth. Many household officers earned enough respect to live well, and some even got small pieces of land as gifts. Some went up high enough for there. Kids could join the lower levels of nobility. They were in a strange limbo, respected, depended on, but not quite noble. They were the glue, the gears, and the quiet professionals who made the realm work. Knights might have charged into battle for glory. Dukes may have plotted in castles, but sergeants and officers made sure the whole thing didn't fall apart every day. They were the hard-working, skilled, and absolutely necessary professionals of the Middle Ages. When you get to the bottom of the noble ladder, you realize something that matters. It wasn't a pyramid in medieval times. It wasn't even a ladder. It was a web of spiders. It was sticky, fragile, and full of creatures that all secretly wanted to eat each other. Every rank depended on the others and was afraid of them. The king was afraid of a revolt. Dukes were afraid of kings. Dukes were scary to counts. Barons were afraid of taxes. Knights were afraid of being dishonored. Poor people scared lesser nobles. Everyone scared sergeants. And peasants, well, they were afraid of wolves, hunger, taxes, and waking up to find out that someone had started a war again. There was no trust in this web. It was built out of duty. To stay alive, a noble had to do their duties, swear loyalty to those above them, protect those below them, and hope that alliances with those on the side didn't fall apart. Feudal ties were formed through oaths that felt sacred but could be broken when it was convenient. A count promised to be loyal to his king until the king made him angry. A baron said he would help his lord unless someone else did. Offer came. The rules were to be chivalrous and honorable. The real rulebook was opportunism, and land was the currency of power. Every acre was important, not just for money, but also for what it stood for. Owning land meant having people who worked for you. Taxes came from peasants. Taxes meant having soldiers. Soldiers were a way to get leverage, and leverage meant that the king had to be nice to you when you came into his hall instead of throwing you in a dungeon. Feudalism worked, even though it had its problems. Or at least it worked as well as any system made in a time when bathing was thought to be optional. The ranks of nobility worked together like the parts of a big machine. Dukes ignored laws that kings made, counts interpreted them, barons enforced them, knights carried them out, lesser nobles supervised them, and sergeants executed them. Everyone had a role to play, whether they wanted to or not. Orders were how power moved down. Taxes, military service, and never-ending apologies were ways that responsibility flowed up. A single insult could start a fight. One marriage could change a map of politics. The whole system relied on relationships that were carefully balanced. Loyalty and doubt, duty and ambition, fear and pride, all mixed together. In the end, kings and castles didn't define the Middle Ages. It was based on relationships, with a constant struggle for honor, status, and survival. You didn't just get a rank when you were born. You were born into a disagreement that has been going on for hundreds of years about what that rank meant. In that argument, every noble, from the king to the lowest household officer, took part. Their part in the huge, chaotic theater of medieval power. Hatshepsut was born into royalty, and her name was written in the stars. She was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and Queen Amosi, and she grew up in the palace like someone who was never meant to live a normal life. In ancient Egypt, they trained princes to take over the throne. Not so much princesses. Their job was to marry in a way that would keep the government stable. But Hatshepsut didn't act right, like someone getting ready for a ceremonial life spent in the shadow of men. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the throne was not just a possibility, even as a child. It was where she belonged. Royalty in Egypt didn't have an easy childhood. But Hatshepsut's education was very hard, even for people who lived in the palace. She learned about the state, hieroglyphics, math, and religion. She learned about religious law and memorized sacred ceremonies that were usually only for future pharaohs. When she went with her, At ceremonies, she didn't just stand behind her father. She looked, she paid attention. She took in every detail of leadership with such seriousness that the old priests raised their eyebrows. A lot of people in the palace started to talk about how she wasn't just the king's daughter. The king's favorite student was her. Then she married her half-brother Thutmose II, which was good for her politically. It was common for Egyptian royalty to marry people in their own family. But this marriage had a deeper purpose. Hatshepsut was the only woman who could keep the dynasty pure and the thrones stable. Her marriage made her even more connected to Egypt's future. Her power grew when she became the great royal wife, but she still didn't have the right to rule alone. But life had other plans. Thutmose II died young, and the throne went to Thutmose III, a boy who was too young to be king. Everyone's attention turned to Hatshepsut right away, not as a queen, but as a regent, a caretaker, or a temporary holder of power. Except Hatshepsut didn't act like a stand-in. She stepped in like a ruler who had been waiting her whole life for this exact break in the system. She had the right family, the right schooling, and the right political instincts. More importantly, priests, scribes, and high-ranking officials trusted her, people who were much more important than what the public thought. The rules said that a woman could not be pharaoh. The whole time she was growing up, Hatep was getting ready to break the rules. When Thutmose II died and left, the Egyptian court was ready for trouble because the heir was just a child. Egypt was a huge and rich kingdom that needed a steady hand, not a little kid with a ceremonial crown that was too big for him. Hatshepsut then stepped up as regent, an adult who was supposed to run the country until Thutmose III was old enough to do so. It sounded like it would only last for a short time, was easy to understand, and was something I was used to. Many queens before her had been regents for a prince when he was a child, but Hatshepsut was different from those queens. She started her time as regent with calm skill. She led administrative meetings, performed rituals perfectly, and brought order to a court that had been shaken by the death of a pharaoh. People in charge who thought they would get a quiet caretaker instead got someone who had power like a cloak over her shoulders since she was born. She spoke with confidence, made decisions quickly, and knew more about Egypt's complicated bureaucracy than most of the men in the room. Something became clear within a few months. Egypt wasn't just getting by under her. Leadership, it was doing well. Things started to change at that point. One title after another began to stick to her name. She did things that were usually the pharaoh's job, not the stand-ins. She was not behind the young king at royal events, but next to him. She slowly and quietly took on a role that no woman was supposed to have. And the court saw that priests, especially those from Amun, liked her. They saw more than just her intelligence. They also saw her piety and political savvy. They said in a low voice that maybe the gods themselves liked how she ran things. High-ranking officials who cared more about running the government than following tradition quietly backed her. Egypt was stable, trade was going well, and temples were getting money. Why change things? But other people watched with more and more worry. A regent was supposed to disappear when the boy king turned 18, not rise like the sun over the sky. And yet Hatshepsut's presence and power grew. She didn't act like a placeholder, she acted like someone, getting Egypt ready for a new kind of leader. The change was complete by the time she turned 7. Hatshepsut was no longer next to the throne. She sat down on it. She did the unthinkable. She said she was Pharaoh, not Queen Regent. Pharaoh has the full title, full power, and full divine right. There was now a woman in charge of Egypt who was not only in charge, but also claiming it. And she wasn't going to give it back. Hatshepsut didn't become Pharaoh on a whim. She had been planning it for a long time. It was a master class in political engineering, religious symbolism, and psychological strategy. No woman had ever dared to take the full throne of Egypt before her. She was not queen, regent, or even queen. She was Pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, the god of the sky. Hatshepsut knew that this had never happened before. She also knew it had to be done. Egypt couldn't afford to be unsure. Long-distance trade routes needed to be protected. Temples needed people to support them. Bureaucracies needed someone to lead them. And to be honest, the boy king Thutmose III was still way too young to handle the stress of an empire that stretched across deserts, deltas, and foreign borders. Hatshepsut didn't take power from disorder. She took it from a vacuum. But she also knew how dangerous it was. The mere concept of a female pharaoh jeopardized the fundamental ideological framework of Egypt. Pharaohs were more than just kings. They were the male forms of gods on earth. It took more than courage to break that tradition. It needed to make up stories. So she made up a new story. In carvings and inscriptions in temples, she said that her father, Thutmose I, had personally chosen her to be his successor. Priests spread rumors that the god Amun had come to Hatshepsut's mother in disguise to tell her about her divine birth. These weren't falsehoods. Egypt used symbolism to run its strategies, and Hatshepsut used it as a weapon. Then her public image changed. She started wearing the full regalia of a pharaoh, including the Nemes headdress, the Shendit kilt, and, most shockingly, the ceremonial beard. She wasn't acting like a man. She was acting like a king in a symbolic way. In Egyptian culture, the role was more important than the person who filled it. Still, she didn't completely get rid of her femininity. Some statues show her as a woman in a dress that fits her tightly. In some, she looks like a traditional king with a bare chest and masculine features. She crafted a fluid identity, part queen, part king, fully pharaoh. It was political brilliance disguised as religious obedience. The court watched. Some quietly supported her. Others whispered, waited, and sharpened their doubts like knives. But no one could deny the truth. Egypt ran better under Hatshepsut than it had in years. Becoming pharaoh wasn't rebellion. It was evolution. She wasn't taking the throne. She was stepping into a role she believed destiny had prepared her for since childhood. And Egypt surprisingly seemed ready to follow. Once Hatshepsut claimed the throne, she faced her greatest challenge, convincing an entire civilization that a woman could embody a role traditionally reserved for men. Egypt wasn't just sexist by culture, It was sexist by theology. The pharaoh wasn't merely a political leader, he was Horus incarnate, the divine son of Osiris. The imagery, the rituals, the titles, everything was built on masculine symbolism. Hatshepsut didn't try to erase this structure. She was smarter than it. There was one idea that her plan depended on. Identity in Egypt was performance, and anyone who could perform kingship convincingly could be king. So she crafted a new visual language for herself. In statues, she appeared with the traditional kilt, broad chest, and the iconic false beard worn by male pharaohs. It wasn't a disguise, it was a costume like a modern judge's robe or a monarch's crown. It signaled legitimacy, continuity, and sacred authority. Priests understood it, officials understood it, even commoners understood it. When the figure looked like a pharaoh, wore the crown of a pharaoh, and spoke with the authority of, it was a pharaoh, then it was a pharaoh. But Hatshepsut didn't take away her womanhood. She let two things be true at the same time. In some reliefs, she looks completely feminine, wearing the tight-fitting sheath dress that royal women wear. In some of them, her body is shaped to fit masculine ideals, with broad shoulders, an angular jaw, and a strong stance. This wasn't confusion, it was a plan. She gave her audience choices. People who believe in traditional values might hold on to the male-coded images. Progressives might be okay with her as a strong woman. Everyone found something to support. Her best. Innovation was putting these two identities together into a single story. She didn't choose to be a male or female ruler. She became both at the same time, the daughter of a pharaoh and the god's chosen successor. The body didn't matter, the part did. And the beard she chose, which is one of the most famous symbols of Egyptian kingship, became her trademark. There was no glue holding it together. It was carved in stone, a message, a statement, a new way of looking at power. It said, I am Pharaoh because I wear what? Pharaohs wear, do, and command what pharaohs do. The court could whisper, the nobles could pretend to frown. But when her statues appeared in temples across Egypt, towering, serene, unmistakably royal, the message was clear. Hatshepsut had not broken tradition. She had absorbed it, remolded it, and made it entirely her own. She didn't hide behind masculinity. She weaponized it. If claiming the throne was Hatshepsut's boldest move, building was her loudest. She knew something important about Egypt. Rulers lived or died by stone, not by gossip or court politics. A pharaoh's monuments were their voice across the ages. The weak left nothing behind, but the strong carved their names into the bones of the earth. Hatshepsut wanted to be remembered. Her architectural reign was full of ambition. She ordered new buildings everywhere, temples, shrines, obelisks, chapels, and statues. It was as if Egypt itself had woken up and started to grow. And in the middle of this building was Frenzy's masterpiece, Jez-Jeseru, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahi. It was like an ancient wonder built into the cliffs of Thebes. Terraces rose like steps to the heavens. Columns were perfectly lined up, and ramps led up to sanctuaries that glowed with incense and the colors of the gods. It wasn't just a temple, it was a statement carved in limestone. I am Pharaoh. I am timeless, her loyal official Senmut led the architects who designed the complex with mathematically perfect and stunningly beautiful. The reliefs inside told stories of her divine birth, her coronation, and her deeds. A political campaign carved in stone instead of shouted in court. And unlike other rulers whose monuments screamed conquest, Hatshepsut's temple emphasized harmony, religion, and prosperity. It reflected her reign, calm, stable, and undeniably grand. But Jajazaru was only the crown jewel. Hatshepsut also revitalized the Temple of Kararnak, one of Egypt's holiest sites. She built towering obelisks. Huge rose granite spires were dragged hundreds of miles from Aswan. One of her obelisks still stands today, catching sunlight just as she wanted it to over 3,000 years ago. These weren't just monuments, they were political anchors. Every stone reminded Egyptians that her rule was sanctioned by the gods, prosperous in practice and rooted in tradition. Her building projects also employed thousands, stimulating the economy and spreading wealth among artisans, laborers, and priests. Temples, offerings meant jobs, and jobs meant loyalty. Through construction, Hatshepsut didn't just build monuments, she built support. In a kingdom where kings proved their power through war, Shepsut proved hers through creation. Her legacy rose from quarries and desert sands, challenging centuries of masculine rule, not by force, but by scale, beauty, and permanence. She reshaped Egypt's skyline as she reshaped Egypt's memory, and with every stone, she made sure that history could never easily erase her. Never easily erase her, even if her enemies would try. If Hatshepsut's monuments were her voice in stone, the Punt expedition was her voice carried across oceans. Every pharaoh before her had dreamed of reaching Punt, the land of the gods, a mysterious realm rich in incense, gold, ebony, exotic animals, and wonders whispered about in temple halls. But Hatshepsut did more than dream. She launched one of the greatest trade expeditions in ancient Egyptian history, an undertaking so bold it was carved as a victory on par with any military victory. Egypt was powerful, but it wanted certain luxuries that only Punt could provide. Myrrh, the sacred incense used in rituals, medicine, and embalming, was especially important. It wasn't just valuable, it was divine currency. Controlling its flow meant controlling religious legitimacy itself. Hatshepsut knew that trade could do what armies could not, and she was determined to get rich without spilling blood. Under her orders, at the Nile docks, a fleet of big, sleek ships was built. These weren't just fishing boats, they were ocean-worthy ships that could cross the Red Sea. It took skilled sailors, carpenters, navigators, and translators to make this happen. Picture a convoy of gilded ships slicing through the water, sails full, the horizon shimmering with heat and possibility. When her expedition reached Punt, the Egyptians were treated like honored guests. Hatshepsut's reliefs show scenes of abundance, with trees heavy with fruit. with incense resin, piles of gold rings, exotic animals, and even the famously rotund Queen of Punt, who is shown with exaggerated features in the carvings. She is one of the most famous figures in Egyptian art. The images are almost bragging, as if to say, look what diplomacy achieved. No war, no blood, only prosperity. What came back to Egypt was amazing. Shiploads of myrrh saplings to plant in Egypt's soil, which had never happened before, as well as rare goods that amazed nobles and priests, livestock, and more, animals that made temple offerings better, and most importantly, prestige. A ruler who could get Punt's wealth wasn't just good. She was favored by the gods. Hatshepsut even had the scenes carved into the walls of Jezero, making the whole thing a PR masterpiece that would last forever. The message was clear. While other pharaohs conquered their neighbors, she connected worlds. The expedition wasn't just about trade. It was about proving that her reign brought legitimacy, prosperity, stability, and divine blessing. Hatshepsut didn't need a battlefield to show how great she was. She needed ships and the courage to send them beyond the horizon. While Hatshepsut ruled Egypt with confidence and unmatched stability, one figure stood just slightly behind her, watching, learning, and waiting. Thutmose III, the boy king who was pharaoh in name long before he had any real power, grew up under the long shadow of his stepmother's extraordinary reign. To the outside world, he appeared. He was obedient and quiet. But inside the palace, inside his young mind, a transformation was brewing. When Hatshepsut first became regent, Thutmose III was too young to care. The throne meant little to a child more fascinated by chariots, hunting birds, and palace pets. But as he grew older, the political landscape began to reshape the way he saw himself. He wasn't just a prince. He was supposed to be Pharaoh, the sole ruler, the divine embodiment of Horus. Yet every temple relief, every obelisk, every proclamation declared Hatshepsut. She wasn't getting him ready to be the pharaoh. She was ruling in his place. Still, Hatshepsut didn't mistreat him or publicly undermine him. She made sure he got a prince's education, military training, religious instruction, and diplomatic etiquette. She made him commander of the armies at a young age, which seemed generous on the surface, but was also politically smart. A military title satisfied tradition and kept him busy, away from court politics. Meanwhile, her own loyal officials,